Okay, welcome to the Chapter 2 and Unit 2, Basic Computer Repair and Networking Operating Systems Presentation Lecture. Please make sure that you have the note guide that goes along with Unit number 2 so that you can take notes as we go through the Unit 2 content. When it comes to an operating system, what exactly is it? How does it work? Operating system, commonly known as an OS, is a software that provides a computer user with a file system structure and with the means of communicating with the computer hardware. Now, no matter what the type of operating system it is, Linux, Windows, or another type of operating system, every operating system is going to have a core, which is known as the kernel. And in order for operating systems to allow application software to communicate with the BIOS, which is an element of an operating system that we will be talking about in some of our class activities as well as some of our class discussions. Now, if we take a look at this graphic, you will see the typical relationship between the computer hardware and the software. The end games on each side is the computer hardware and the user. The user is going to use hardware to be able to communicate with the software on the machine, and the go-between there is going to be the operating system. So the user may interact directly with the operating system or through an application software, and hardware may also communicate directly with the operating system or through BIOS in order to communicate with the operating system. Now, there are 4 different characteristics involved with any operating system, no matter what type it is. The first characteristic is data processing, or processing data. Data is processed through a number of different tactics, one being multitasking. This is the ability of an operating system to support 2 or more programs running at the same time. So maybe you're checking email and you're also searching the internet at the same time. Multitasking within the operating system allows the user to do that. Now, when it comes to multitasking, there are different types of multitasking, such as preemptive or cooperative. Preemptive is referred to as time slicing. This is the process which allows multiple programs to share control of the operating system. Whereas cooperative multitasking is when one program dominates the operating system but will also allow another program to run while the dominant program is in idle. So multitasking happens in a couple of different ways. And we'll talk about this as well a little bit more with class activities and class discussion. Now, multitasking is not to be confused with multi-threading, which is when data and parts of a program can be shared between 2 or more CPUs or between the 2 cores of a single CPU. So multitasking, multi-threading, the 2 common ways that operating systems can process data. Now, another characteristic of operating systems is the user interface. User interface is used to issue commands on a computer system. There are 2 ways that commands can be issued. One is command line interface, or CLI, and the second is graphical user interface, or GUI. Let's take a look at what these 2 different ways of these 2 dominant ways of users being able to input commands into a computer might look like. Now, CLI, or command line interface, allows commands for the computer to be issued by typing text at a command prompt. So you might get the little prompt window, the black window, which was something that was in operation way back when with some of the first operating systems, which were known as DOS systems, or disk-operated systems. These are the major operating systems that were put in computers in the 1980s. Very difficult to use. They're based on text-based commands, and they are still used primarily in troubleshooting with today's PCs. Modern Windows systems do not use DOS, but a DOS emulator that has the look and feel of DOS is available. So if we were to open up our command prompt window and wanted to insert some commands into it in order to communicate with our operating system, we might use a command such as cd. cd is going to change from the current location in the directory to another directory. We might use check disk. This might be one that you've already used to determine whether or not one of your disk drives has errors or is failing. And then maybe exit. This is going to exit the command prompt and then take you back to the Windows desktop. Now, any of these others would work as well. I'd be interested to see if any of you have used any of these command prompts in communicating with your operating systems in the past. We'll talk more about these as well in class. Now, the graphical user interface, which is what most of us are probably most familiar with, which is also known as GUI or GUI, allows the user to perform functions by selecting on-screen icons rather than by issuing text commands. GUI is obviously more user-friendly than DOS. The GUI displays the file system consisting of folders, icons, and names. Obviously a more graphical, picture-oriented type of display. An advantage over DOS is that the entire file structure is easily displayed and interpreted. Now, a file system, which is the third characteristic of an operating system, this is going to refer to the method of organizing files on a storage device. It is used by the operating system to keep track of files. Files are organized in what's known as file tables, which is a component of the file system used to organize files on a storage device. Now, when it comes to operating systems, they're probably going to use a combination of, or at least one of these different types of file structures. FAT, which is File Allocation Table, 12, 16, or 32, or NTFS, which is also known as New Table File Structure. So any one of these are going to be ways that the operating system is going to communicate with the files and store the files so that the user can access them. Now, the configuration files, which is the fourth characteristic of the operating system, these are the files containing information such as the amount of memory and the type of video adapter present in the system. The configuration information is stored in what's known as config.sys file of the DOS systems. This now in some of the more current operating systems is known as a registry. This is a database that stores configuration information. Now the information in the registry is stored in system.dat or user.dat file extensions. Now when it comes to booting a Windows PC with a Windows operating system, there is a sequence that is used by the operating system in order to properly boot up. In order to understand how a Windows operating system boots up, you have to understand that there's two different types of boot. There's a cold boot. This is when the computer is booting up from a completely powered down state, versus a warm boot, which is a restart, which sometimes happens once updates have been sent to the machine or to the operating system. Now, the operating system boot sequence, if we take a look at the right column, which is probably what we're going to be, most of us are going to be experiencing because we're using operating systems such as Vista 7 and 8 versus Windows 2000 and XP, we're looking at the post, which is step number 1, which is also known as the power on self-test. There's the initial startup phase, the Windows Boot Manager phase, Windows Boot Loader phase, the kernel loading, as well as the logon phase. We will be going through each of these different steps in class discussions as well as activities to get you familiar with how each of these steps work and what happens in each of these steps. Now, also you might run into a situation if you have multiple boot systems. So let's say, for example, you have a dual boot system or a multiple boot system. A dual boot system is when two operating systems are installed on a single computer. And a multiple boot system is when a computer contains more than two operating systems. However, one thing to remember is that only one operating system can be run at a time, even if there are multiple or just dual boot systems on a particular PC. Now, when it comes to some other common terminology, an application software, also referred to as end-user software, this is designed for a specific purpose, such as creating databases, spreadsheets, word processing, producing graphics, or just for entertainment. And then there's also software drivers. Software drivers are small packages of programs which allow proper communication between the computer and a peripheral device. Sometimes operating systems cannot communicate with a particular hardware piece that a user plugs into the machine, and a software driver must be downloaded in order for that communication to take place. Now, there's also software patches. These are fixes for operating systems and applications that have already been released. Now, usually operating systems and software go through countless hours of testing. That doesn't mean that all the errors have been eliminated. Whenever an error shows its ugly face, it is referred to as a bug. And periodically, large collection of patches are released at once and referred to as a service pack to address many bugs. You may have seen this with earlier versions of your operating system, possibly Windows Service Pack 1 or Service Pack 2, etc., etc. This concludes the presentation lecture for Unit Number 2, Chapter 2, Operating Systems. Please make sure that you have completed the note guide for Unit Number 2. And if you have not, please revisit the slides to make sure that you do have all the notes and that you can use the note guide as a study tool for upcoming assessments. I will see you next time we meet in class.